So our first speaker in this session is Professor Larissa Behrendt. Her biography is extensive and you'll be able to see it in the program. But in short, Larissa is one of Australia's leading Indigenous scholars, deeply involved both in academia but also in film and in culture, and she's going to come and speak to us a little bit around how we weave power of Indigenous storytelling into our after-COVID world. So Larissa, please come to the stage. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, and for the privilege of addressing you today. I'd of course like to start by acknowledging the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation on who we're meeting today, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and thank them for the generosity with which they share this country with us. And I think it's a particularly important ceremony to perform in this space at this time, as we're amongst our most prominent academics, great minds and thought leaders within our academies, to be acknowledging that there is another set of knowledges and knowledge holders that we share this country with, another parallel system that's been long overlooked, but that we're acknowledging more and more. So I thought I'd start by just reflecting that when the news of COVID started to break and its impact in China, and there was certainly a sense that something was amiss, I was actually out at Oak Valley on the Maralinga lands where I was doing some work with the community on a project. And this community of Oak Valley has the most remote health service in South Australia, so it's incredibly isolated in that sense. But even there was a understanding that something was brewing that was important to address. And it was interesting to watch how quickly that community-controlled health service swang into action to bring the community together and explain that there was this virus called COVID, and to go through the hygiene protocols that the community would have to address. And it was interesting too that there was then obviously a big discussion about the importance of closing the community off and making sure that nobody was coming in that could endanger them in this climate. And I thought what was really interesting about watching that in action was a few things. One was to just see how nimble the community governance was. Oak Valley is run by the Maralinga Jarracha Lands Trust, so has its own local government, so was really able to make those decisions very quickly. And it also showed how important those community-controlled organisations are in terms of understanding the cultural fabric of the community, and also knowing who's in the community, who's going to be vulnerable, to ensure that everyone who needs to be looked after is looked after. So I think it's a really important reflection on the importance of empowered local community structures as well. So I think what we saw just within using Oak Valley as an example was we saw that all of those positives, but it also brought into stark relief some of the inequities that I think COVID has highlighted throughout our society as a whole. Particularly were the concerns around the cost of food and access to food, which, as you know, has been a long time challenge for Indigenous communities, but that came into stark relief. And also, as well as the lack of access to services, just the ability to get other supplies in as well in that short time frame. So, as I said, I think it highlighted what was important in terms of that community-controlled sector. And in a way, it was, again, a microcosm of, I think, the really important role that our community-controlled health organisations played generally at that moment. With very limited resources, they did a lot of heavy lifting at that time. They organised a lot of information campaigns, much like the nurse at Oak Valley had done, but quite extensively, ensured that there was education campaigns about the importance of us accessing the flu vaccination shots in case people did get COVID, and this would help ensure that the underlying factors might be minimised. And I think it's important to reflect on their achievements in that space, because government supported those actions of locking communities down and assisting with those issues. But inevitably and understandably, given they were facing a national issue, could not move as quickly as what the Indigenous community organisations themselves did. And it really showed their role importantly in closing that gap. And of course, I think one of the things that we all reflect upon is we talk a lot about closing the gap and using that difference in life expectancy as a key indicator of how far we've got to go or how far we've come. And this was probably a moment that brought home what that actually means in reality in terms of that gap in life expectancy and health. As you might recall, when the government listed its most at-risk groups, they were people 70 years and over, people 60 years and over with underlying health issues, and Indigenous men and women over 50. So that was a reminder of how stark that gap was, and a shock for many of us who found ourselves in a vulnerable cohort and, weren't allowed to go to specific places or into work because we fell into that. So I guess it did bring home those truths and what it can mean. Obviously, of the sectors that were hardest hit earliest was the arts, which is what we're focusing on now. And I was mindful I was going before Bethwin, who'll speak much more about the actual impact on the sector with much more data. So I thought I'd keep my observations more anecdotal and observational. But what we saw through that period, of course, was the cancellation of performances, exhibition closed, and some of our community-controlled arts centres, really important hubs, both artistically but also culturally and socially in these lockdown communities, and their closure off from the rest of the community had a huge impact on them, both in terms of art practice but also commercially. Of course, there were no tourists coming through and no trade. We have one large performing arts company. The largest is, of course, recognised as the Bangarra Dance Theatre, but so many other smaller performing arts companies, particularly in the areas of theatre and dance and community arts centres. So I think that they can easily be identified as some of the places that were hardest hit in our community first, and again, both with a cultural impact but also an economic one as well. Many artists were contractors, so not eligible for JobKeeper, and arts funding hasn't trickled down to them, and I think that's also ground that Bethwin will cover in her talk as well. But I do want to make this point. I mean, I think we do analyse the impact of this sector, and I think what the Indigenous communities show us is how difficult it is to siphon off the impact of COVID by simply looking at the impact on the arts and the creative industries. And we really need to appreciate it as a sector that's part of a much larger ecosystem, particularly when we're talking about tighter-knit communities and smaller economies. And I say that in terms of tighter-knit communities and smaller economies, not just for our remoter and rural, but I think even within cities we can talk about tight-knit communities there that operate within their own little microcosm as well. Obviously the impact on closing down those communities and those centres, and particularly in the early days where movement was quite limited, had a very profound effect on cultural life. Art practice, as you might appreciate, is still very communal in how it's practiced within Indigenous communities. So these restrictions had a huge impact in that way, as it also did on the performance of ceremonies, especially where borders were closed, so stopping movement, say particularly between Western Australia, South Australia, the Northern Territory and Queensland, where cultural groups overlap. There was that significant impact as well. But I do think it's a reminder that we need to appreciate the connections between creativity and the rest of our life. So despite the challenges that COVID and its restrictions have posed, I think I also sense within the community optimism and opportunity. And that was partly, I think, because, or primarily because, the virus did not, at least to date, sweep through Aboriginal communities as was first anticipated and rightly feared, given experience with other pandemics and other health issues. So the sense that people were able to respond successfully has been something that people have been very proud of, and I think gives them a sense that the community structures, the community governance structures work really well when they're empowered to make decisions in that very agile way that they were. And I often hear people talk about the concept in this context of COVID of the resilience of Indigenous people, and we talk about that a lot in relation to Indigenous culture, and resilience becomes a word that's often invoked in that way. But certainly there was a view that the ability to deal with a crisis like COVID could be contextualised by people, particularly elders, saying they saw the crisis as simply another bump in the road. Their lives had often been disrupted, they'd often been marginalised. They would say, we're used to being at the bottom of the ladder. And while I think we can rightly conceptualise this as a crisis like no other that many of us have experienced in our lifetime, there was still a philosophical sense that this was just one more disaster sent to test us. And with very dark humour, heard a couple of elders reflect that we've survived smallpox, so we can survive this, which, as I said, is fairly dark in its sense of humour, but I think also is a reminder that there is resilience in all of us that we need to tap into. And as I said, the impact on communal practice was deeply felt, especially in the initial stages of COVID, where personal restriction was much greater. But we did see people engage much more personally with cultural practice as a way of ensuring well-being. In my own family, we began making my brother's possum coat a very important part of our processes. He's now the oldest cultural male in the family. And as you might know, usually the possum cloak making is very communal, and people will sit around the table as it's sewn and as it's carved, as you do the imprints on the pelts. And it's a time of storytelling, but an exchange. So that communal aspect of it's really important. But we started the possum cloak making process as a way for us all individually to have moments to reflect with cultural practice. And I think that's sort of been a way that we've continued to connect and do cultural practice through that time. And I think we've also seen artists themselves be very entrepreneurial. We've seen a lot more of selling of art online, and art centres that were particularly well placed to take advantage of the technology, both because of their skill set and their location, had moved very quickly to try and think of that as a way to keep their markets, or to even sometimes expand their markets. And we've even seen some putting of the art markets and small business events and performances online. And I think the dance rights program at the Opera House is maybe a really good example of this. I think it would have been seen as almost offensive to have suggested that a dance program like Dance Rights should be done virtually before COVID. I think the whole idea of it was really focused on groups from across the country coming together as part of that cultural exchange, and there would have been a very strong view that there's no way that that could be done in a virtual sense. So I think what COVID challenged people to do was to think about the importance of continual cultural practice and exchange through these constraints. And I really credit Rhoda Roberts with how she crafted this. So she did manage to pull together a program where the dances were recorded. And I think what was really interesting about it was that there was an appreciation in doing this event this way, that actually the recording of the dance did two things. It created a record of it, a digital record for the community. And she spoke to me about how one of the Yolngu elders, who was quite elderly and frail and would not have been able to travel to Sydney to perform anyway, was really joyful about the fact that he could perform and that there would be a record if he wasn't around in future to be able to do that. So there was that sort of sense of pushing people to think about these opportunities in that way. And of course the audience reach was so much greater. Putting it online meant that people who couldn't have travelled to see it as a not just as a performer but as audience, it really opened it up. So I think it was a good opportunity for people to think outside of things that had been where we've been so set in a cultural space, to think about the advantages of doing things differently. And I think that's been really true of the performing arts, and Bethwyn will probably speak more about that more generally within the sector, but I think this is a really good example of that. And I can't imagine we'd ever not want to do these kind of corroborees in person. We'll always value that aspect of it. And I would even sense that that would be prioritised, but the ability to be able to dovetail that with the capturing of culture and the inclusion of those frail voices that otherwise can't leave a community, so in some ways are the most precious ones to capture, has really challenged people to understand that there can be a way of adapting cultural practice to meet those things. So I think the other thing I just wanted to touch on as well was that I think the virus has highlighted, as I said, many weaknesses already in our economic, democratic and social system, which were already cracks before, easily papered over, and I think that's been a larger thematic here today. But I do think it's important to perhaps just do a reflection on the fact that that has meant, I think, from an Indigenous perspective, as we've been going through this particular moment of COVID, that there has been noticeably a bigger response to the Black Lives Matter movement. It is true to say after every death in custody, and there's been about one a month since the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody closed off its period of looking at deaths in custody. After each of those deaths, there's been community mobilising, there's been families mobilising to bring awareness to the circumstances of that particular death that have often occurred in custody in circumstances that were unfair, public and egregious. But I think it's true to say that many of us have felt that something's shifted in this Black Lives Matter moment that we haven't seen before, and not just in the US but in here. And it was apparent that the death and circumstances of the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis were an opportunity to put the spotlight on the issue here, and I think made all the more prominent because of the circumstances of the death of David Dungay in Sydney, who also couldn't breathe. I'm sure you're all familiar with that instance because it became very highly publicised because of the parallels between not being able to breathe. And I think it was noticeable for many of us who've had a long history of advocating in this space for law reform around really the implementation of the recommendations of the Royal Commission, which continue to be pretty much the same agenda today. that these kind of community protests or opportunities to engage in activism trying to get some kind of justice for each of these deaths as they occur so systematically. It would often be the case that a turnout of around 50 at a march would seem to indicate that something had changed. So to have those moments where thousands of people turned out during those large marches around the country when they were able to be had, and bearing in mind a lot of people chose rightly not to attend but would have been there in spirit because of the COVID restrictions, I think showed a real shift. And I'm not necessarily signalling that as the opportunity to now see the changes that we've advocated for so long. I'm probably a little too cynical to see that, but I think we've actually seen a change in the conversation more broadly, which is important and I think will perhaps be an opportunity to lead to some of those changes. That discussion is different and it's in the mainstream and acknowledges that there is such a thing as systemic racism. I think that's a really important change, and it's a change that we also see in the language. We're familiar in the Academy with the concepts of white supremacy and white privilege, but it's not usual. I'd never seen it before, that actually in the process of street protest and marching and those kind of grassroots activist marching, that you would see those kind of slogans around ending white supremacy and that white privilege is the problem, particularly as slogans embraced by non-Indigenous people. That seemed to show a shift and a real way in which the language and the thought and critique that we've seen within the Academy has now translated into broader mainstream language, and it's changing a shift. So that does give me optimism about what regeneration looks like. And our efforts here, I think, have been some cause, as I've said, for optimism, and you just need to look at how we've managed to keep COVID out of our vulnerable communities here, our Indigenous communities, and compared to the way in which the virus really swept through the Navajo community in the United States. It was one of the first hit, hardest hit, with similar demographics, remote areas, low socioeconomic position, poor services. And I think that puts us, even in looking at where we sit in how we've dealt with the COVID threat in Australia compared to Europe and the US. And I think that for a couple of reasons that I just wanted to reflect on. The first is that I think it's sometimes even hard to remember we had a summer of bushfires because we've focused on COVID for so long, but it really was a time where we saw an increased interest in Indigenous knowledges as a result of that, much more interest and engagement with things like fire burning technology and sustainability. And I also do think that there's been a profound cultural impact in the work of Bruce Pascoe through Dark Emu, and whatever the academic critiques might be of some of the work that he's done there, there is no doubt that the success of that book in the mainstream has really changed perceptions about Indigenous culture and Indigenous knowledges in a really positive way that means much more interest and engagement in this area. That I think we see more Australians think more deeply about the way in which we live on this country and what we can learn from peoples who survived on it for over 65,000 years, and what we can learn about from those knowledges, particularly as we go forward and look at the challenges we'll have around climate there. I think for me too that one of the things that is contained so centrally in our knowledge systems is actually the importance of story and the power of storytelling. And I think at moments like this, that's a really important idea to hold on to. Because of our COVID response, we are actually, in terms of the creative arts sector, going to be ready to perform and create again much earlier than other parts of the world. And this will be a huge benefit to creative practices and industries, both culturally and economically. So just use one practical example, the film industry here, productions are actually back and filming, albeit with COVID restrictions and COVID compliance, but they are filming, and that is simply not happening in other parts of the world. So production companies that have an arm in Australia and an arm in US are unable to continue with productions there, because even if they start, they almost invariably have to close down again because somebody gets COVID. So their production stop and start, so the risk becomes really high and the cost becomes really high. So but in Australia, even though the COVID compliance costs have, COVID compliance has added costs to productions, we're in a much better place to be able to actually produce content. And I've actually heard quite a few people in the industry say recently there is some concern that we might actually almost have a skills shortage because there is so much production being shifted to Australia because we've been able to do that. I think we can also see with some optimism when we think about the restarting the industry that had been so affected. I look at what Wesley Enoch's doing with Sydney Festival and putting on a festival for the first time that is only Australian content. Now that might seem a pretty sensible thing to do, as nobody would want to take the risk of having international groups come over and them pulling out, but actually it was a strategic and deliberate investment in our local content that guided his decision, particularly recognising the importance that performers have to perform. So even if audiences are less because we can't get as many people into the venues, that actually the process of getting performers back to working and being paid is actually an important role that we need to be investing in. And of course, within that is a very strong contingent of Indigenous storytelling. One of the things that I've been doing while we've been locked down in COVID, and a lot of our projects have been put on hold as we couldn't travel, was updating my Indigenous Australia for Dummies book, which I hadn't done for about 10 years. And I was really interested that the chapter that I had to spend the most time updating was the chapter on film and television, because so much good content had been produced over the last 10 years in relation to what we're seeing on our screens. And it did actually feel like that was a place where there had been the most gains. Obviously, I grew up in an era that you would have all been familiar with where there were no Indigenous people on television, and to see the rise of an industry now in that period has been really exciting, but I also think speaks to the importance of Indigenous storytelling as a central theme through our more general narratives that we are interested and engaged with as Australians as part of our narrative there. And I do think that there is a role for that storytelling in the national agenda as we go forward. We talked about truth-telling a lot before COVID, partly because it was such a strong thread of the Uluru Statement, but even more than that, I think we've been talking about this issue of truth-telling and this history, breaking that great Australian silence. That has been work that we've been doing before then, and you know that the Academy had played a big role in trying to pivot on. And I think the thing about storytelling is that it's an important thing to be looking at during these times as we're seeking to rebuild, as we inevitably will have to after COVID. What I think is important about storytelling in our culture is that we often see it as a way to heal, and you would have seen that a lot in terms of how we deal with trauma and the importance, say, of having people who've been members of the stolen generation be able to tell their story. So we see it as a way to heal, but we also see it as a way to weave and strengthen, that we share our stories. It's part of the reason why possum cloak making is communal, that you will share the stories of somebody that's close to you to celebrate their life and get all your connections together, and it makes you feel stronger. And I do think of storytelling like weaving, because as we tell our stories, we see what intersects, and we find our connections and how we're tied to each other. And then the fabric of our connection and the fabric of our community becomes stronger. There's a cohesiveness that builds. And I think we need that investment in storytelling because of this power that it has to weave us together. So I just finally wanted to end on a note, going back to the issue of what I saw in Oak Valley and shared with you at the beginning of my talk. And I do think, while I see so much positivity about an opportunity for Indigenous culture and storytelling to be leading as we think about how we recover, how we get through COVID and how we recover and rebuild, I do think that there is one thing to take note of in terms of the point I made about the importance of the Indigenous community-controlled sector in terms of, and Indigenous governance structures that were in place that allowed that swift response to COVID. Often when we've had these issues of crisis and we get through them and there's rebuilding, it's often non-Indigenous NGOs that are tasked with that, not our community-controlled organisations. And we've had a long history of seeing that rebuilding work put in a way that doesn't support and in fact actually undermines both our community-controlled organisations and our governance structures. So I think that's something that we're very mindful of. I have optimism about the new partnership agreement around the new Close the Gap agenda that's recently been announced. It's a much broader Close the Gap agenda with new targets, particularly around justice and child removal, which are two areas that the community has long advocated for to be included there. And just having more of a focus on those within the Close the Gap agenda, I think will be a positive. But the thing about the partnership agreement that I think is really important is the role it gives to our community-controlled organisations in that sector to be a seat at the table and to be involved with the oversight and assessment, evaluation and implementation of policies and strategies around Close the Gap. So I would hope that that perhaps could mean that we would see more investment in that sector and us not make the mistake again of thinking it's the non-Indigenous NGOs that will be able to do that work. Thank you.